Hello, welcome. If you're watching this right now, there's a good chance it's late. Maybe the room is dark. Maybe you've already pulled the blanket up around your shoulders, or you're lying on your side with the phone balanced just right so you can see the screen without holding it. Maybe someone is asleep beside you, or maybe the apartment is very, very quiet and the only sound is whatever hum your building makes at night. That low, structural kind of sound that you stopped noticing years ago, but that's still there if you listen for it. A lot of people watch this channel to fall asleep. That might sound strange, horror stories as a sleep aid, but I think you already understand it. There's something about a voice in the dark that feels safe. Something about letting someone else's story fill the space in your head, so your own thoughts don't have to. I get it. I really do. So settle in. Get comfortable. You don't have to go anywhere. I want to mention something quickly, and then I promise we'll get into it. This channel isn't monetized. There are no ads. You're not going to get jolted out of the mood by someone trying to sell you a mattress or a meal kit. Not here. Not tonight. If you want to support what we're doing, the best thing you can do is subscribe. Just hit that button if you haven't already, and leave a comment. I'm always curious about where people are watching from. It genuinely surprises me sometimes. So if you feel like it, just drop your city, your country, even just a region. I like imagining all of you out there in the dark. All right, let's begin. I need to go back to the summer I was 26, because that's where this starts. That's where everything about the way I understand safety started to change. I'd been living in the city for about 3 years at that point. I had a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking, and I had a job I didn't hate, and a few friends I saw on weekends, and a life that felt, I don't know, assembled, like furniture from a box. Nothing was wrong with it exactly, but nothing felt chosen either. That summer my grandmother passed away. It wasn't sudden. She'd been declining for a while, and by the time it happened, we'd all had time to prepare ourselves. Or at least we told ourselves we had. She lived alone in the house she and my grandfather had shared for over 40 years. He'd been gone for almost 12 years by then, and the house needed to be cleaned out, inventoried, prepared for sale. My mother couldn't do it alone. She had my younger brothers, but they were useless for that kind of thing. The kind of slow, emotionally careful work of going through someone's entire life, object by object. So I volunteered. I told her I'd take 2 weeks off work and drive out there and handle it. She cried a little when I said that, which made me feel useful in a way that surprised me. I packed a bag, and I drove the 4 hours to my grandmother's town, and I pulled into that familiar driveway, and I turned off the engine, and I sat there for a moment. The house looked exactly like I remembered it. Pale yellow siding, white shutters, the big oak tree in the front yard that I used to climb as a kid, and that now had a birdhouse nailed into it that I didn't remember being there. There was a low garden along the front of the house with plants in it that had grown wild and a little leggy since no one had been tending them. The porch steps had a new crack in the second one from the bottom. I noticed it immediately, without knowing why it bothered me. My mother had overnighted me the keys, and I let myself in. The house smelled like my grandmother. It always did. That particular combination of lavender sachets and something baked. even though nobody had been baking in there for months. And underneath that, something slightly stale the way old houses get. A closed-up smell that isn't unpleasant but is very specific and very hers. I stood in the entryway and just let that hit me for a moment. It's one of those things nobody tells you about grief. That smells can just take you apart. I'd planned to start in the kitchen because it seemed the most practical, least emotionally loaded room, and I figured I could get my bearings before I had to go through the things that would really hurt. The photographs and the jewelry and the books with her handwriting in the margins. The kitchen was fine, ordinary. Dishes in the drying rack that had been sitting there long enough to gather a light film of dust. A calendar on the wall still open to the month she'd gone into the hospital. I took that down carefully and looked at it for a long time. She'd had appointments written in her careful cursive, a dentist visit, a book club meeting, water roses written on a Tuesday, a life just in pencil. I folded it and put it in the box I'd started for things I wanted to keep. I worked until about 7 o'clock that first evening, and then I ordered takeout from a place in town and ate it sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, which felt strange, eating my own food in her kitchen, surrounded by her things. After that, I went upstairs and made up the guest room bed with fresh sheets I'd brought from home. I know that sounds odd, but I didn't want to use her sheets, not yet. And I lay down, and I fell asleep very quickly. The first thing that bothered me was so small, I almost didn't register it. I woke up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom. The house was dark and very still, the way houses in small towns are still at night. Completely, deeply still. No traffic sounds, no voices, just the occasional creak of the settling structure. I didn't turn on any lights because I knew the layout well enough. I padded down the hall to the bathroom, used it, and on my way back I passed my grandmother's bedroom door. It was open. I had closed it the previous afternoon. I distinctly remembered doing it because I'd glanced in as I passed, seen her made bed with the pale blue coverlet she'd had for as long as I could remember, and I'd quietly pulled the door shut because seeing that room felt like too much for day one. I remembered the small click of the latch. Standing there in the dark hallway, I stared at the open door for a moment. There was a reasonable explanation. The latch hadn't fully caught, and the old house settling had nudged it open. That happens. Old doors are like that. I pulled it closed again, making sure it latched this time, and went back to bed. I didn't think about it again until the next afternoon. I'd been working in the living room, carefully going through the bookshelf and making decisions about what to keep, what to donate, what to set aside for other family members to look through. It was slow work, and it was the kind of work that keeps pulling you out of the task, because you keep finding things that stop you. A book with a photo tucked inside it, a Christmas card from someone you don't know, a ceramic figurine that you'd completely forgotten, but that your body remembers as soon as you hold it. Around 3 o'clock, I went to the kitchen to make some tea, and I noticed that the back door was unlocked. I frowned at it. I'd locked it the previous afternoon. I was sure I had, because I'd done a circuit of the house when I arrived, testing all the locks, making sure everything was secure before I settled in. The back door had been locked. Now it wasn't. I stood there for a moment, and I felt something some early version of a feeling I can't fully name. Not fear, exactly. More like a question mark that had appeared somewhere inside my chest. The reasonable explanation was that I'd checked it again in the night without remembering. I'd been tired. I'd been grieving in that low-level way that doesn't feel like grieving, but is. The kind that makes you vague and forgetful. I locked the door and went back to making tea, and I told myself that was the answer. That evening I was sitting in the armchair in the living room going through a box of my grandmother's photographs when I noticed something on the side table beside the couch. There was a glass of water there, half full. I stared at it. I hadn't put it there. I was certain I hadn't put it there because I'd been drinking tea all day, and I'd been using one of the ceramic mugs from the cabinet, not a glass. I got up and went to it, and looked at it, and there was nothing strange about it. It was one of her ordinary glasses from the cabinet in the kitchen, filled with water to about halfway. But the water had the slightly warm temperature of something that had been sitting out for hours. It wasn't fresh. It had been there a while. I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen and poured it out, and stood at the sink for a moment. A mouse, maybe. A bird that had gotten in somehow. Something that had knocked the glass over and... No, the glass was upright. There was water in it. I went through the house more carefully than I had the day before. I opened every closet. I checked under the beds. I looked in the basement, which was unfinished and just held the furnace and water heater, and several boxes and a bicycle my grandfather had owned that nobody had been able to throw away. Nothing. The basement door was locked from the inside, as it should be. I went back upstairs and I checked the guest room window and the bathroom window and my grandmother's bedroom window, all locked. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed and I thought about it rationally. I was in a house I hadn't been in for 2 years. I was operating on not enough sleep and too much grief, and the slightly surreal experience of handling someone's entire physical life. I was misremembering things. I was, almost certainly, misremembering things. I locked the back door again and I pushed a chair against it, and I told myself that was unnecessary, but I did it anyway. And then I went back to the photographs. I found one that stopped me completely. It was a photograph of the backyard. It was older. The color had that slightly faded, oversaturated quality of photographs from the early 90s. And it showed the yard in summer, full green, the garden my grandmother used to keep, the wooden fence along the back, and in the window of the house, the kitchen window, you could see inside to the kitchen, just barely, just a glimpse of the counter and the refrigerator. And standing at the counter, visible only from behind, was a figure. I turned the photograph over. Nothing written on the back. I turned it over again and looked at the figure in the window. It was probably my grandfather. It was probably any number of people. The image was too small and too blurry to make out any real detail. Just the silhouette of a person standing at the kitchen counter. I put the photograph in the keep box anyway, because everything in this house felt like it belonged to a story I didn't fully know. And I thought my mother might recognize who it was. That night, I slept badly. I kept waking up and lying still in the dark, listening to the house. It was just the normal sounds of an old house at night. The creak and tick and occasional groan of wood contracting as the temperature dropped. but every sound felt like it had intent. I'd hear something shift, and I'd hold my breath and wait, and then nothing would happen, and I'd breathe again. And then half an hour later, something else would settle, and the whole cycle would start over. At some point in the very early morning, maybe 4 or 4:30, I heard the back door, not open. I mean, I heard someone at the back door, the sound of the handle being tried, not loudly, very quietly, the way you'd try a door handle if you were trying not to wake anyone up. I heard it once, and then silence, and then once more. I lay completely still in the dark. The chair. I'd pushed the chair against the door. I thought about the chair. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, and I went to the top of the stairs, and I listened. Nothing. Just the house sounds. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. Long enough for the fear to shift into something more exhausted and uncertain. And then I went back to the guest room and sat on the bed, and I did not sleep again. In the morning, I went downstairs, first thing. The chair was still against the back door. The door was still locked. I moved the chair, unlocked the door, and stepped out onto the back porch. The yard was quiet. The birds were going. The grass was wet with dew. But there, in the soft ground of the garden bed, just beside the back porch steps, there were marks. I crouched down and looked at them. They were footprints, or they looked like footprints. The ground was soft, and they weren't clear enough to make out a shoe size or any real detail. Just shallow depressions in the soil where something heavy had stood. There were 2 of them, side by side, just at the base of the steps. I crouched there for a long time. The neighbor to the left was an elderly woman named Patricia, who had been my grandmother's friend. I knew her a little. I thought about going over and asking her if she'd seen anything, if anyone had been around the house in the time since my grandmother went into the hospital. But it was still only just past 6 in the morning, and I couldn't make myself knock on someone's door that early. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug, and I tried to think about it calmly. The back door had been unlocked. I might have unlocked it myself without remembering. The footprints in the garden. Someone could have come by. A neighbor who knew my grandmother. Someone checking on the place. There were people who looked after each other in small towns like this. Somebody might have come around the back to check on the garden. Water it maybe, and tried the back door to let me know they were there, not wanting to ring the bell at an odd hour. That was a reasonable explanation. I convinced myself of that while I drank my coffee, and I started going through the boxes in the spare bedroom closet, and I kept myself busy until noon, when I went over and knocked on Patricia's door. She was lovely. She made me sit down and have lunch with her. She'd known my grandmother for 30 years, and she talked about her the way you talk about someone you've loved for a long time, with that particular mixture of tenderness and specific, fond complaint. She said she'd been keeping an eye on the house. She came over every few days to check the back garden, because my grandmother had asked her to keep the roses watered, and she had a key, a spare key, that my grandmother had given her years ago. She'd been over 3 days ago, she said. She'd watered the roses and checked the back door and gone home. I felt the relief of a clean explanation, and I thanked her warmly, and I told her to please keep the key in case anything came up. and I walked back across to my grandmother's house, and I felt considerably better about everything. That afternoon I found the second glass. It was in my grandmother's bedroom. I'd finally opened the door and started going through her things, slowly, carefully, the way the task demanded. I was at the small table beside her bed when I saw it. A glass of water, set neatly on the nightstand, half full, the same temperature as the one I'd found 2 days before, not fresh. I stood there with my hands very still at my sides. Patricia had been here 3 days ago. She'd watered the roses. She'd checked the back door. She had a key. This glass could have been here since then. My grandmother kept water on her nightstand every night of her life. That was just a habit of hers. And maybe Patricia had come into the bedroom for some reason and left a glass there, and I hadn't noticed it until now. Except I had been in this room before. I had opened the door on the first night and looked in, and I was certain there had been no glass on that nightstand. I'm going to be very honest with you. I didn't call the police. I know that might seem like the obvious thing. I know that might seem like the thing that any sensible person would do at this point. But I was 26, and I was in my grief, and I was alone, and the whole thing felt so ambiguous, so perfectly explainable in multiple ways, that I couldn't make myself do it. I couldn't make the call and describe a glass of water and a door and footprints in a garden bed and feel like I wasn't being irrational. Instead, I drove into town, and I bought a simple door alarm, the kind that hangs on the door handle and shrieks if the door opens. I put one on the back door and one on the front door, and I went to bed that night with my phone fully charged on the nightstand, and a kitchen knife I'd felt pathetic putting there, but had put there anyway, within easy reach under the mattress edge. I did not hear either alarm go off that night. I slept, not well but uninterrupted, and in the morning when I got up, both doors were still closed, and the alarms were still in place. But there was a glass of water on the kitchen table, different from the one I'd emptied and washed. A clean glass, filled from the tap, set at what I can only describe as my place. The chair I'd been sitting in for every meal, every cup of tea, every working session at that table. I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I looked at it for a long time. Both door alarms were intact. Both doors were locked. The windows were all locked. I walked through the house one more time, very slowly. Every room, every closet, the basement again, and I found nothing and no one. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I looked at the glass of water. And then I did what I probably should have done the moment I found the second glass. I called my mother. I described everything, calmly, in order. The unlocked door, the open door in the night, the footprints, the glasses of water. She was quiet for a moment when I finished, and then she said, "That sounds like Margaret." Margaret was my grandmother's younger sister. She was 81 years old. She lived in a town about 40 minutes away. She and my grandmother had apparently had what my mother described carefully as a difficult relationship for the last several years, and there had been some issue. She was vague about it, with Margaret believing certain things in the house belonged to her, or should come to her. And my grandmother had had to have a specific conversation with her about that, and it had been unpleasant. My mother said that Margaret had a history of just arriving at places. She'd shown up at my mother's house once at 6 in the morning, 2 years ago, because she'd had a dream that my mother needed her. She was not, my mother said, choosing her words carefully, always reliable in her thinking. Does Margaret have a key to this house? I asked. She shouldn't, my mother said, but she might have made a copy years ago. She and your grandmother used to be very close. I sat there with the phone pressed to my cheek, and I looked at the glass of water on the table. I think she's been coming into the house, I said. I think she's been coming in and sitting here and, I don't know, drinking water and sitting here. My mother was quiet again, and then she said, I'll call her. She called her. Margaret picked up after 2 rings and was perfectly pleasant and said that yes, she had been to the house twice since her sister died. She had a key. She just wanted to sit in there. She found it comforting. She was sorry if she'd frightened anyone. She hadn't realized I'd be there. That was the answer. An 81-year-old woman, quietly letting herself into her dead sister's house and sitting in the kitchen and drinking a glass of water and then going home. I know it sounds like nothing, and I told myself it was nothing. Grief makes people strange. She was just an old woman who missed her sister. But I keep thinking about the last part, the part I told you and then moved past. She hadn't realized I'd be there, but I had been there for 3 days when she left the 3rd glass. She knew I was there. She would have seen my car in the driveway. She would have heard me moving around inside. And she still came in. And she still sat down. And she still set a glass of water at my place. As though we'd agreed to share the space. As though we had some kind of arrangement I hadn't been informed about. And she never knocked. She never called out to let me know she was there. She just came in and sat in the kitchen with me without my knowing. In my grandmother's house that still smelled like lavender and old wood, and set a glass of water where I would find it. I think about what she might have done if I'd come downstairs in the night. Whether she would have said something, or whether she would have just sat there in the dark, very still, the way you sit when you're hoping not to be noticed, and waited for me to go back up. I stayed 1 more week, and I finished clearing out the house, and I drove home. And I've never told that story to anyone except my mother, and every time I've told it, I've ended it at the part where my mother explains about Margaret. Because that's where the reasonable explanation is, and you're supposed to end with the reasonable explanation. But every time I tell it, I think about those glasses of water. Half full, always half full, like she always stopped at the same point and never finished. And I don't know what to do with that detail. I still don't. This next one is harder for me to talk about, and I'm going to ask you to stay with it even when it gets strange, because it's something I've spent a long time trying to understand, and I'm still not sure I do. About 4 years ago, I started losing time. That's the only way I know how to say it. I'd be in one place, and then I'd be somewhere else, and the middle part was just not there. Not black, not dark, nothing dramatic like losing consciousness. Just absent, like a cut in a film, one scene to the next, and you don't even notice the cut until you stop and realize you have no idea how you got from one scene to the other. It started small. I'd be driving home from work, and then I'd be in my parking space with no memory of the last 10 minutes of the drive. I told myself that was normal. Highway hypnosis. Everyone does that. I'd be watching TV, and then it would be 2 hours later, and I'd have no real memory of those 2 hours, even though clearly I'd been sitting there watching TV. I told myself that was just zoning out, just the particular numbness of spending too much time on a screen. But then it started getting longer, and then it started being in places I couldn't explain. The first time it really scared me was a Tuesday in November. I remember leaving my apartment that morning to go to the coffee shop 2 blocks away. I do that most mornings. Get a coffee, sit there for half an hour before work. Just have some time before the day starts. I remember walking out of my apartment and locking the door. I remember starting down the stairs. Then I was sitting in my car in a parking lot I didn't recognize. My coffee was in the cup holder, still warm. The clock on the dash said it was just past noon, so I had lost approximately 5 hours. I was in my car with my coffee, in a parking lot in an industrial area of the city I almost never go to. About 3 miles from my apartment, my car was parked correctly in a space, not running. I was just sitting there. I sat there for a long time after I realized what had happened. I felt completely normal. I didn't feel dizzy or disoriented or sick. I felt fine, just empty where those hours should have been, like reaching into a pocket and finding it cleanly gone. I drove home. I called my doctor and made an appointment. I didn't tell anyone else because I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding like something was very wrong with me. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet. My doctor did blood work. She asked me about my sleep, my stress levels, my drinking, which was minimal at the time. She talked about dissociative episodes. She talked about stress-induced fugue states. She ordered an MRI, which came back clean. She referred me to a therapist, which I started seeing, a very calm woman named Dr. Reeves, who talked to me about trauma responses and the way the mind protects itself by stepping away. I had had a difficult year before this started. That's true. There were reasons the mind might want to step away. I accepted that framing. I went to therapy. I paid attention to my stress levels. I tried to sleep more and drink less coffee. The episodes continued. They became almost regular, once every 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes more often. I'd lose anywhere from 20 minutes to, in the worst cases, most of a day. The not knowing where I'd been was what disturbed me most. Always when I came back, I was somewhere slightly different from where I'd started. Another room, another street, once across town. Always fine, always apparently unharmed. Just moved. I started keeping a log. My therapist had suggested it, a way of tracking patterns. Date, time, what I remembered before, what I found when I came back. I kept it in a small notebook in my jacket pocket, and I wrote in it every day, including on the days nothing happened. About 3 months into keeping the log, I noticed something. On days when I lost time, the entries I wrote when I came back, were slightly different from my normal handwriting. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice unless they were comparing side by side, which I was obsessively, but the pressure was different, slightly lighter, more careful, as if the hand holding the pen was less sure of itself. And the words were different, not in content. They described the same things, but in phrasing, slightly more formal, slightly careful. I stared at those entries for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. It means, I eventually concluded, that the part of me that was doing things during the lost time was also writing in my notebook. The part that drove 3 miles and parked and sat in an industrial parking lot was also, apparently, keeping my log for me, carefully, conscientiously, in handwriting that wasn't quite mine. I want to be clear. This is the kind of thing that when I tell it to you, sounds like a horror story. I know that. I know how it lands. And I'm not trying to suggest that there was some other person living inside me, taking over, doing things. That's not what I believe happened. What I believe, what my therapist and eventually my psychiatrist helped me to understand, is that there was a part of my mind that was fully functional and fully operational during these episodes. A part that could drive and navigate and write in a notebook, but that for reasons to do with trauma and stress responses was operating separately from the part of me that forms continuous memory. It's a known thing. It's in the literature. There's a name for it. Knowing that doesn't make the notebook less frightening to look at. But the thing that really broke the framework, the thing that pushed it out of the realm of clinical explanation and into something I couldn't fully account for, was what I found in my apartment during month 6. I'd lost a day, an entire day. It was a Saturday, and I woke up Sunday morning with no memory of Saturday at all. None, not even fragments. I'd lost days before, but they'd never been complete like that. A total clean wipe. I was scared in a way that previous episodes hadn't scared me, and I sat in my bed and I took stock of myself, checked myself for injuries, looked around the room. The room looked normal. My apartment looked normal. I got up and walked through it carefully, the way you do when something feels slightly off and you can't name what. On the kitchen counter, there was a bag of groceries. I hadn't bought groceries on Friday. I'd been meaning to go over the weekend, but here was a bag on the counter, partially unpacked. Most things had been put away, but a few items were still in the bag. A bunch of bananas, a small carton of eggs, a box of the specific crackers I like, the thin kind with rosemary. In the refrigerator, the things from the bag had been put away neatly. There was a container of leftovers I didn't recognize. Looked like some kind of stew, something cooked from scratch. Sealed carefully and pushed to the front of the shelf. I stood in front of the open refrigerator and looked at that container for a long time. I went to the notebook. The Saturday entry was in that slightly different handwriting. It said, went to the farmer's market in the morning, bought food, made soup in the afternoon, took a long walk by the river. That was it. Just that. A day's activities, summarized in that careful, slightly foreign hand. I ate the soup. I should tell you that. I was hungry, and it was right there, and I ate it, and it was good. Really good, actually. Better than I usually cook. Whoever had my hands on Saturday knew what they were doing. I went to my therapist that week, and I told her about the soup. I told her about the groceries and the notebook, and I watched her face carefully while I talked. She was a skilled enough therapist that her face didn't give much away. But there was a moment, a very brief moment, where something moved behind her eyes that she quickly replaced with professional calm. She said, "Let's talk about increasing the frequency of our sessions." I said yes, and we did. And over the next several months, slowly, the episodes started to become less frequent, and then rare, and then eventually almost stopped. Not fully stopped. I still have them occasionally, maybe once every few months. Always small now, 20 minutes here, half an hour there. But nothing like what it was. But here's the thing I need to tell you. The thing I've never told anyone. Not Dr. Reeves, not the psychiatrist, not anyone. Toward the end of that period, when the episodes were becoming less frequent but weren't gone yet. I lost about 2 hours on a Wednesday evening. I came back sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea in front of me and my notebook open. The entry from those 2 hours said, in that familiar, slightly different script, "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this for both of us. I'm very tired." I read it 3 times. I read it until the words stopped looking like words and became just marks on paper. Then I looked up at the kitchen wall, and I sat there for a very long time, and then I closed the notebook. I've never opened that entry again. I know it's there. I know what it says. And every time I think about it, I think about how I understand the clinical explanation, and I believe it, and I hold on to it firmly because the alternative, the idea that there was something on the other side of those gaps that had its own inner life and its own exhaustion and its own sense of carrying a weight, is not something I know how to hold. Not then. Not now. The notebook is in a box in my closet. I haven't thrown it away. I don't know why I haven't thrown it away. I think I'm afraid of what it would mean if I did. I have to tell you about my neighbor Marcus, or rather the man I thought was my neighbor Marcus, because I'm still not entirely sure those are the same person. I moved into that building, different apartment, different city from the last story. This was maybe 8 years ago now, and Marcus lived across the hall. We were the kind of neighbors that are friendly without being friends. We said hello in the hallway, had brief conversations about the building's temperamental elevator, held the door for each other. I knew he worked in some kind of IT field, and that he had a sister who visited occasionally, and that he didn't cook much because I almost never smelled food from his apartment. That was the extent of it. He was perfectly ordinary. That's the part I want you to hold on to. There was nothing unusual about him for the first probably 8 months that I lived there. Normal-looking guy, mid-30s, a little quiet, a little pale the way people who spend a lot of time at computers get. Nothing. The first thing was the schedule. I'm someone who notices patterns. I don't try to. It's just how my brain works, cataloging the rhythms of things around me. And I started to notice after those first 8 or so months that Marcus's schedule had become extremely precise, like to a degree that registered as unusual even for a creature of habit type person. He left every morning at 8:07, not 8 o'clock, not sometime between 8 and 8:15. 8:07. I noticed this because I leave for work around the same time, and his door would always open just as I was getting my keys. And I started watching for it, testing it, looking at my phone as his door opened, and it was 8:07 every day, every single day. He returned every evening at 6:23. Same thing. I tested it. 6:23, door opening, footsteps in the hall. Now, people have routines. I know that. Trains run on schedules. Workplaces start at specific times. People are creatures of habit. An extremely regular schedule is not inherently alarming. But there's something about this level of consistency that felt different from normal routine. Because trains are sometimes late. Buses are sometimes early. Roads have traffic. Weather changes. Small delays accumulate. Normal routine has a margin. This had no margin at all. 8 months of 8:07 and 6:23, and never once a deviation I can remember. The second thing was the groceries. I was in the lobby one Saturday when he came in carrying 2 bags from the supermarket down the street. We said hello. He went upstairs. Normal. 2 weeks later, same thing. 2 bags. same supermarket, and 2 weeks after that. Every 2 weeks on Saturday, exactly 2 bags. I started noticing the brands on the outside of the bags. The same store, which didn't mean much on its own. But then one time I was behind him in the lobby, and I could see a little inside one of the bags, and I noticed it was the same things. Same green bottle, same box, same produce, every 2 weeks. I want to make clear that I'm aware of how this sounds. I sound like I was being strange about this, cataloging my neighbor's habits in a way that was itself unusual. And maybe I was. Maybe the strangeness was in me. But I want to try to convey what it felt like from the inside, because from the inside, it didn't feel like suspicion or obsession. It felt like pattern recognition that I couldn't turn off. Like when you see an optical illusion, and you can't unsee it. Something was slightly wrong with the regularity of things. The way something is slightly wrong with a painting that's been reproduced too many times. A small but perceptible mechanical quality underlying the surface. The third thing was harder to articulate. I started noticing that Marcus never varied. Not just his schedule, not just his groceries, but him, his facial expressions, his gestures, the way he spoke. In the hall when we passed, he'd say the same kinds of things in the same cadence. "Hey, how's it going?" Not quite a question, more of an utterance, and "have a good one," as he reached his door. Not exactly the same words every time. Close, but not exact. What was the same was the way he said them. The pause between sentences, the slight nod, the movement of reaching for his keys. Once I ran into him at the supermarket, same one his bags came from. This was a Saturday afternoon and I was there picking up things, and I turned a corner, and there he was. And I watched, without meaning to, as his face rearranged itself into the hello neighbor expression. The exact same rearrangement I'd seen in the hall dozens of times, like something being called up from a file. The slightly delayed quality of it, as if it had to travel a little farther than it should. "Hey," he said, "didn't know you shopped here." "Yeah," I said, "most weekends." He nodded in that specific way, reached for something on the shelf. This particular kind of thing makes me sound like I'm making this up, but I'm not. The same thing that had been in his bag, same green bottle. "Have a good one," he said, and moved on. I stood there in the aisle for a moment, and I thought, I have never seen him surprised, not once. Not by running into me unexpectedly in a store, not by any piece of news I'd mentioned in our hallway conversations, not by anything. Every encounter felt prepared for, anticipated, like the encounter had already been processed somewhere, and he was executing the response. The fourth thing happened on a Tuesday evening. I was coming up the stairs. The elevator was broken again, which was not unusual, and I heard his door not opening. I was still 1 floor below. I heard something from behind his door, very faint, very brief. It sounded like his voice, but the cadence was different. Faster, less spaced out, almost urgent, and then nothing, and then the normal sounds of the building. I told myself he was on the phone. People sound different on the phone, more efficient, more urgent, particularly when talking to someone they're comfortable with versus a neighbor they chat with, briefly. A completely reasonable explanation. I told myself that, and I went into my apartment and I sat down on my couch and I stared at my wall. About 2 weeks after that, his sister came to visit. I'd seen her before, a few times. Similar coloring to Marcus, a few years younger maybe. the same kind of unremarkable pleasantness. She'd visited 3 or 4 times in the time I'd been there. We'd said hello in the hall. This time she arrived on a Friday evening and she was crying. Not dramatically, not audibly from the hall, but I passed her at the elevator, and her eyes were red, and there was the tight-held quality in her face of someone who had been crying and was trying not to show it. We said hello. I asked if she was okay. She said yes, fine, just tired. She looked at me for a moment, a longer moment than the brief glancing acknowledgement of neighborly interaction, and then she went into Marcus's apartment. I didn't hear anything from across the hall that evening. No voices, no sounds. In the morning, the sister left very early. I know because I heard her in the hall around 6:30, before I was really up. I went to the peephole. I'm not proud of this, but I went to the peephole and watched her leave. She was walking fast. She had a small bag with her that she hadn't arrived with. She didn't look back at the door. I have no explanation for what I'm about to tell you. I want to say that clearly. I have turned it over and looked at it from every angle, and I have no explanation that satisfies me. That same morning, around 8, I opened my front door at the same time as Marcus was opening his. 8:07, of course. We both stepped into the hall at the same time, and we both sort of stopped, the way you do when you've exited simultaneously. And I looked at him, and he looked like Marcus. He was dressed like Marcus. He was standing the way Marcus stands. But his eyes were different, not in a supernatural way, not glowing or changed color, or anything that would have made this simple. They were the same eyes, the same brown, the same shape. But the expression in them was different from any expression I'd ever seen on him. It was like looking at a room where all the furniture is exactly the same, but arranged wrong somehow. Not wrong enough that you could point at any one piece and say this is the problem. Just wrong enough that your body registers it before your mind catches up. "Morning," he said. Same cadence. "Morning," I said, and he walked to the elevator, and I walked to the stairs because the elevator was still broken, and that was that. I moved out 2 months later. I had reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus. The lease was up. I'd been thinking about a different part of the city. It made sense. But when I was packing my things, I found myself doing it faster than I needed to, moving with an urgency that wasn't about the move. I ran into the building's manager once after I'd left at a cafe, and we talked briefly, and I asked him, trying to be casual about it, whether Marcus was still in the building. He said, "Marcus in 4B? Yeah, he's still there. Good tenant. Never any trouble." "His sister come to visit sometimes?" I asked. The manager looked slightly confused. "He doesn't have a sister," he said. "He's told me he doesn't have any family in the city. Lived alone since he moved in." I nodded and said something about how I must have been thinking of someone else, and I paid for my coffee, and I left. I've thought about Marcus a lot over the years. I've thought about what the explanation might be. A girlfriend he described as his sister for some reason. Someone he was hiding. A woman who looked like him. There are explanations. I just can't make them stick. What sticks is the image I keep coming back to, the one that I can't quite let go of, late at night in particular. His sister walking away from his door very early that morning, walking fast, with that small bag she'd arrived without, not looking back. I think about what someone packs in a hurry, what they decide, in the dark of early morning is necessary to take with them and what they decide to leave behind. I hope she's all right, wherever she is. I'll tell you about the road. This was maybe 5 years ago. I was driving across the country, not for anything profound, just relocating, driving a moving truck with my car hooked on a trailer behind it, making the trip in stages over 4 days. I'd done road trips before. I know how to read a highway and how to manage long drive fatigue and when to stop. Day 2. This is the day I'm talking about. I was somewhere in the middle of the country, one of those states that feels like it's mostly made of sky and flat land, and I'd been driving for about 6 hours. I was planning to stop in a town called Kellerton. I had it pulled up on my GPS about 40 minutes ahead. Get a motel, get a meal, sleep. I started seeing signs for Kellerton. That's normal. The approach signs, 20 miles, then 15, then 10. I was following the GPS. I was paying attention. I pulled into Kellerton, and it was exactly what I expected. A small, clean, slightly faded town. Main Street with a hardware store and a diner and a gas station. A motel on the edge of town that the GPS had highlighted. A water tower. The kind of town that could be any town in that part of the country. I stopped at the gas station first to fill the truck's tank. The man at the counter was older, 60s, and he said hello and asked if I was passing through. I said yes, relocating, planning to stay the night. He said the motel was good, clean rooms, and there was a diner down the street that did a decent dinner. I thanked him and drove to the motel. The motel had an older woman at the front desk with a name tag that said, Greta. She checked me in, gave me a key, an actual metal key, not a card, which I liked, and told me the room was second from the end. Parking was around the side. I got into my room and I sat on the edge of the bed for a while the way you do after a long drive, just letting the movement drain out of your legs. The room was fine, clean, as the gas station man had promised. A window air conditioner that made a reliable sound. I took a shower and changed and walked down to the diner. The diner was called Kay's. There was a waitress who introduced herself as Donna and who recommended the pot roast without my asking, and I ordered it, and it was good. And I had a piece of apple pie after, and I drank 2 cups of coffee slowly, and I felt the particular contentment of a road trip evening done right. Simple pleasures. I paid and tipped well and walked back to the motel, and I went to sleep. I woke up at 7 the next morning and got ready, and loaded my few things into the truck, and pulled back onto the main road heading west, following the GPS, and drove. About 3 hours later, I started seeing signs for Kellerton. I looked at them. I looked at the GPS. The GPS showed me coming into Kellerton, but I'd just left Kellerton 3 hours ago. I pulled over to the shoulder and sat there with the engine idling. I thought about this. I must have gotten confused, taken a wrong turn, circled back somehow. The GPS had rerouted me and I hadn't noticed. Something like that. I looked at the GPS history. I'd been going west the whole time. Consistently west. I pulled back onto the road and drove into Kellerton. The gas station, the hardware store, the diner, Kay's, the motel. I pulled into the gas station to fill up again, even though I didn't really need to. The same man was behind the counter. He said hello and asked if I was passing through. Exactly the same as he'd said the day before. I looked at him carefully. I was here yesterday, I said. He looked at me with a pleasantly blank expression. "Is that right?" he said. "Yeah. Filled up yesterday afternoon, staying overnight at the motel. Lots of people pass through," he said. "Good luck with the drive." There was nothing wrong with that response. It was a perfectly ordinary response. He probably did see dozens of people pass through in a week. I was just another one. I drove to the motel. Greta was at the desk. "I was here last night," I said. "Room 7? She looked at the ledger. Physical ledger, another relic. I remember noticing it both times. And said, "I don't see a booking for last night. Did you use a different name?" "No," I said. "My own name. I paid cash." She looked at me without quite looking at me. That particular slightly avoidant hotel gaze. "I'm sorry. I don't have a record of that. Would you like a room for tonight?" I stood there for a moment. I said no, and I went back to the truck. I sat there in the motel parking lot, and I thought very carefully about the previous evening. I thought about Donna at the diner, and the pot roast, and the apple pie. I thought about the metal key, and the room with the window air conditioner. I thought about all of it, and it was vivid, and specific, and real. I pulled out of the motel parking lot, and I drove to the diner. Kay's was open. A different waitress, not Donna, came to take my order. I asked if Donna was working today. She looked at me with mild confusion. "There's no Donna here," she said. "Just me, and there's Karen in the back." "Maybe she's off today," I said. "Honey, I've worked here for 9 years. There's never been a Donna here." I ate a sandwich and I paid, and I drove back to the highway, heading west. I pressed on the gas, and I kept the speed up, and I watched the miles counter, and I watched the GPS, and I paid very careful attention to everything I passed. I drove for 4 hours, longer than I needed to get out of that county. I kept going until the landscape started changing, and I was in different terrain, rolling hills now where there had been flat land, and I only stopped when I reached a town I didn't recognize at all, a town I had definitely never been to, and I checked into a motel there and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. There's a thing that happens to the brain on long drives. There's a dissociative quality to highway driving in flat terrain, the sameness of it, the way mile markers become meaningless and towns bleed together. I know this. Sleep deprivation compounded it. I'd been on the road for 2 days and probably hadn't slept as well as I needed to. It's possible I'd stopped in another town the previous night that was very similar to Kellerton, and I'd confused them. Small towns in that region do look alike. Same Main Street template, same water tower, same motel configurations. It's possible I'd passed through Kellerton twice. Once the real first time, and once a reroute I didn't properly register. Donna could have been a waitress at the previous town's diner who happened to have introduced herself, and I'd carried that detail forward into my Kellerton memory incorrectly. The mind does that, fills in gaps with adjacent material. It's possible. Here's what I can't fully account for. I had a metal key in my jacket pocket when I walked into the Kellerton motel the second time. I hadn't given it back. I hadn't checked out. I'd just left in the morning. It was in my jacket pocket. I discovered it that evening, in the not Kellerton motel, when I was looking for my phone. It was a plain metal room key with a small plastic tag. The tag had a number on it. 7. I carry that key with me. I don't know why. I carry it on my keyring along with my actual keys, and I've never taken it off. Sometimes when I'm in a new place, a new city, a new building, a hotel, I touch it with my thumb the way you touch a worry stone, and I think about that diner and the pot roast and Donna with her recommendation I hadn't asked for. I think about the water tower and the light and the flat sky and Kellerton, which I have looked up on a map many times and which exists, which I can find on a map, which is real. I've never driven through that part of the country again. I've had chances. I've found reasons not to. I'm not sure I could explain them if I tried. My Aunt Agnes needed someone to stay with her. That's how this began. She was 73, and she'd been doing well on her own for a long time, after my uncle died. She was that kind of woman, fundamentally capable, the kind of person who fixes things herself and doesn't ask for help and considers independence a point of pride. But she'd had a fall in the spring, nothing serious. She'd been fine, but it had shaken everyone in the family, and she'd agreed, reluctantly, to let someone come stay for a few months while she recovered properly and got her confidence back on her feet. I was between things. I'd just finished a contract job, and the next thing hadn't started yet, and I had about 3 months of relative freedom. I liked Agnes. She was funny and sharp, and she read voraciously and had opinions about things and could hold a conversation for hours. The idea of spending a few months in her house with its big windows and its garden didn't seem like a burden at all. I volunteered. I arrived in early June. Agnes was delighted to see me in that contained way she had, where delight was expressed through increased brightness in the eyes and absolutely no effusiveness, no hugging, because Agnes did not hug. She shook hands like a Victorian businessman. We shook hands. I brought my bags in. She showed me to the guest room at the top of the stairs, and then we had dinner together, and it was excellent. The first few weeks were genuinely nice. We had a rhythm quickly, the kind of rhythm that happens when two people who both like structure find each other's structures compatible. We had breakfast together. Then she read or worked in her garden while I worked from my laptop, and then lunch. And then she napped in the afternoons, and I went for walks. And then evenings we'd cook together. Or rather, she'd direct and I'd execute, because her kitchen was her kingdom. She was sharp. That's the thing I need to establish clearly. She was funny and quick and precise in her language, and her memory was excellent. She remembered the details of things she'd read decades ago, could quote pages from books, recalled conversations accurately enough that when she started a sentence with, "You said last Tuesday," I'd learned to assume she was right. For the first several weeks, she was exactly herself. Then she started calling me the wrong name. It happened first in the 4th week. We were in the garden and she called me, I'll use a fake name here. She called me Eleanor. My name is not Eleanor, and has never been anything like Eleanor. I stopped and looked at her, and she was looking at me with completely ordinary eyes, no confusion in them, just saying what she'd been about to say to Eleanor. "Sorry," I said. "Who?" She blinked. Then she said my actual name, with a short laugh. "Sorry, I don't know where that came from." And she went back to what she'd been saying. I noted it, filed it. It happened again 3 days later. Again she corrected herself quickly, easily, without distress, and again a few days after that. I mentioned it to my mother on the phone, gently, because my mother was her niece and I didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. My mother said she'd had it checked recently, and there was nothing of concern, that sometimes people mix up names, especially as they got older. That seemed right. I've mixed up names. Everyone has. I put it in the same category as forgetting where you've put your keys. But then I started noticing it wasn't just the name. There were other things, small things. Agnes began referring to things that I was fairly certain weren't accurate memories. She talked about Eleanor, the name she kept using for me, as though Eleanor were a real person she'd known. She'd say things like, "You always did that, even when you were small," or "You haven't changed, have you?" with a warmth that was specifically calibrated for someone she'd known a long time. And when I gently asked who Eleanor was, she'd pause and then say something like, "Oh, never mind, I'm confusing myself." But the third time I asked, she said, with the careful patience you use on someone who is being obtuse, Eleanor is my daughter." I sat with that for a moment. Agnes did not have a daughter. She had 2 sons, one of whom lived in another country, one who lived about an hour away. I knew her family reasonably well. There was no Eleanor. "Agnes," I said carefully, "you have 2 sons, Michael and David. There's no Eleanor." She looked at me for a long, still moment. Her eyes were perfectly clear and perfectly calm, and she said, "I know that." And then she picked up her book and started reading. I told my mother about this. My mother called Agnes. Agnes, apparently, was perfectly coherent on the phone, was funny and sharp and asked detailed questions about my mother's life, and said I was doing wonderfully and the arrangement was working out very well. And there was nothing in the conversation, my mother said, that seemed the least bit off. I went back to watching and waiting. The thing was, and this is the part that's hard to explain, Agnes was mostly fine, mostly exactly herself, the sharp and funny and capable woman she'd always been. It was only in specific moments that the Eleanor thing surfaced, and in those moments it had a quality that I've been trying to find the right words for ever since. It didn't feel like confusion. It didn't feel like someone slipping backward into a fog. It felt very specifically like something else. It felt like someone who had 2 separate pictures they were sometimes showing you. Like the Agnes I knew and the Agnes who knew Eleanor were both completely coherent, both fully themselves, and they just occasionally got their pictures mixed up when they were reaching for which one to show. I started listening more carefully to what she said about Eleanor. The picture that emerged over weeks of fragments was this. Eleanor had been Agnes's daughter. She had been born when Agnes was 22. She had been with Agnes for about 5 years, and then she had died. Of something. Agnes never said of what, in those moments. The way you sometimes omit the worst thing because you've said it too many times, and saying it again takes something from you that you can't afford. And Agnes had never told anyone. Or if she had, she'd stopped. And in the family history I'd absorbed, there was no Eleanor, no pregnancy when Agnes was 22, no 5-year period that had been accounted for. I found a photograph. I wasn't looking for one. I was helping Agnes sort through some boxes she'd asked me to bring down from the attic because she wanted to organize them, and in one of the boxes, packed carefully in an envelope inside a larger envelope, inside a folded piece of cloth, as if nested and protected through many years, was a photograph. A young woman with a child on her lap. The woman was clearly Agnes, young, maybe 23, 24. The child was about 2, sitting very straight, looking at the camera with a serious expression. A little girl. I put the photograph back. I wrapped it in the cloth and put it in the envelope and put it in the box, and I carried the boxes where Agnes had asked me to put them, and I didn't mention it. I don't know what I was protecting. Agnes from the memory, maybe. Myself from the conversation. Both of us from whatever that photograph meant. The keeping of it and the hiding of it, and the way Agnes, decades later, would sometimes look at me with a specific warm recognition and call me by a name that had no one living to answer to it. 3 months passed. The fall came, and Agnes was better, more confident on her feet, and the family agreement was that I'd go home when she was ready. She said she was ready in September. On the last morning I was there at breakfast. She called me Eleanor, and this time when I started to correct her, she held up one hand, just slightly, just the small gesture of someone asking you to wait. And she said, "I know who you are. I'm not confused." She looked at me very steadily. "But sometimes," she said, "it helps to pretend." Then she poured her tea and asked me what time my train was. I told her the time. She said good. She'd make something for me to take on the journey. She stood up and went to the kitchen, and I sat at the table, and I looked out her window at the garden and the morning light, and I thought about the layers a person can carry inside them, the rooms they learn to lock and which they open and for whom, and whether what I'd witnessed was a kind of loss or a kind of preservation, and I still don't know the answer to that. On the train, I found a small wrapped parcel in my bag, sandwiches, carefully made, a note in Agnes's handwriting, "For the journey. Thank you for coming, my dear." She died 2 years later. Her sons arranged the funeral. The obituary mentioned her late husband and her 2 sons, and her love of gardening and books. I kept the note. I want to tell you about the job. The job that was only supposed to be temporary. I was 29, and I needed work, and a friend of mine knew someone who ran a small residential care facility. Not a hospital, not a nursing home exactly. More of a transitional care setting, a place where people stayed for a few weeks or months while they were recovering from various things, medical or otherwise, before they could return home. My friend described it as quiet work, low stress, a lot of sitting with people, and the hours were nights, which suited me because I was finishing a degree in the evenings and my schedule was inverted. I interviewed and got the job and started training. It was, largely, what my friend had described. A quiet place, a night shift with very little happening, mostly checking in on residents, keeping the common room available for anyone who couldn't sleep, doing rounds, writing up notes. The supervisor was a practical woman named Joan, who had been doing this work for 15 years and who had the particular combination of warmth and efficiency you develop when you care about people, but also need to get things done. There were usually 10 to 12 residents at any given time. They came and went. Most were elderly, recovering from surgery or illness. Some were younger, dealing with longer recovery processes. Everyone was there voluntarily. Everyone knew where they were. There was nothing institutional about it. The rooms were furnished with personal things people had brought from home. There were communal meals. There was a garden. It felt, to the extent that I thought about it at all, like a humane place. About 3 months into the job, a new resident arrived. His name in the file was Mr. Carl Hennessy. He was 64, according to his intake paperwork. He'd come from a hospital about 2 hours away, recovering from a pulmonary issue, needed a few weeks of monitored rest before returning to his own home. He was pleasant at intake, quiet, polite, thanked everyone for everything in a way that felt sincere rather than performative. I first had real interaction with him about a week after he arrived. I came on shift at 11 and did my first round, checking in on everyone, making sure all was comfortable. His room was near the end of the hall. I knocked, and he called me in, and he was sitting up in bed reading, which was common. A lot of the residents had trouble sleeping and read late. "You're the night staff," he said. Not a question, just noting. "That's right. Anything you need?" "No," he said. And then, "What time is it?" I told him. He nodded and looked back at his book. I noted him in my log and moved on. The second interaction was 2 nights later. He'd come to the common room at about 2 in the morning, which was unusual but not alarming. I found him there in one of the armchairs, not reading, not watching the television that was available, just sitting. He looked up when I came in. "Can't sleep," he said. "That happens here," I said. "Do you want tea or anything?" "No. I'll just sit for a bit." I sat in one of the other chairs because it was that kind of shift. Nothing urgent happening, and it was part of the job to provide company when it was wanted. He didn't start a conversation immediately. We sat in companionable quiet for a while, just the night sounds, and then he said, "How long have you been working here?" "About 3 months." He nodded. "Do you like it?" "I think so," I said. "It's quiet." He smiled slightly. "Quiet is underrated." He went back to his room around 3, and I made a note and moved on. The thing is, we started to have this kind of interaction regularly. He'd be in the common room in the early morning hours, or he'd call me in when I knocked during rounds, and we'd talk. He was interesting to talk to. He had opinions and stories and asked questions that seemed genuinely curious rather than social courtesy curious. The kind of questions that showed he'd been listening. I told him more than I usually told residents, because the conversations warranted it, and because his interest felt real. He told me very little about himself. I noticed this gradually. He'd respond to direct questions in a way that answered them without really providing information, the smooth deflection of someone practiced at it. Where was he from? Oh, here and there. I moved around a lot. What had he done for work? Various things. Nothing very interesting. Did he have family? A very brief pause. Not close by. It took me about 2 weeks to notice that everything he'd told me consisted of either responses to direct questions or observations about things other than himself. He'd told me about his reading preferences, which were specific and eclectic. He'd told me about a particular city he'd passed through once that had stayed with him. He'd talked about light, actually, about the quality of light in different places in a way that was strangely absorbing, but nothing about who he was, where he'd come from, why he was here specifically, the details beyond the medical summary in his file. This wasn't alarming. Some people are private. Some people, especially older people recovering from health scares, want to be somewhere other than inside their own biography for a while. I appreciated that. I'm the same way. What started to bother me was something else. There was a resident. I'll call her Mrs. Ferreira. She was in her late 70s. A lovely woman recovering from knee surgery, who had been there about a month before Hennessy arrived. She and I had a warm rapport. She reminded me of my own grandmother a bit. Sharp wit, very good memory. One evening she stopped me in the hall, which she didn't usually do, and said very quietly, "The new one." "Sorry," I said. "The new gentleman, Hennessy." She looked down the hall in the direction of his room. "There's something not right about him." I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" She looked at me for a moment. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I just feel it. He smiles at the right times, but I don't know. Have you noticed it?" She paused. "He never blinks quite right." I went home from that shift thinking about what she'd said, thinking about how to dismiss it, because she was elderly and had been here a while, and sometimes people's perceptions drifted in care settings. And also I genuinely liked Hennessy in the way of our 3 in the morning conversations, and I didn't want to look at him differently. But I started watching. I watched for about a week, and I couldn't see what she'd meant about blinking. His blinking seemed normal to me, or at least I couldn't isolate anything about it. But there was something about timing, something about the very small delays between social stimulus and social response. The way, for instance, if I knocked and opened the door and said, "Hey, just checking in," there would be a half beat before his face moved in response. A half beat smaller than I'd have noticed consciously if I weren't watching for it. I have a close friend who is a clinical psychologist. I met her for coffee on a day off, and I described Hennessy without naming him. Just described the traits I'd been noticing, the conversation deflection, the timing delays, the slight mechanical quality underneath the apparent warmth. She listened without interrupting, and then she said, "That sounds like someone who has learned to emulate social behavior rather than experiencing it organically." "What do you mean?" "I mean, most of us develop social responses naturally, in childhood, through attachment and mirroring. We just absorb how to interact. But some people, for various reasons, early trauma, certain kinds of neurological difference, prolonged social isolation, learn it more consciously, like studying a language as an adult versus growing up speaking it. You can become fluent, but the fluency has a different quality. There's usually a very slight processing delay. The grammar is right, but something else is slightly off. I thought about that for a long time. It explained almost everything. Almost. Here's what it didn't explain. About 5 weeks after Hennessy arrived, he got a phone call in the evening that was noted by the evening staff member in the log. Residents occasionally got calls on the facility's phone. Standard. He took it in the common room, and it lasted about 10 minutes. The next morning, Joan called me into her office. She had his file open on her desk. She said, "I got a call last night from a hospital administrator, from the hospital that referred Mr. Hennessy to us." "Okay," I said. They were calling to follow up on a patient they'd transferred here a few weeks ago. She looked at me steadily, except the patient they were describing. Same name, same age, same medical background. Is still in their facility. He's been there the whole time. He hasn't been discharged. I sat there. Apparently there was a clerical issue at their end, Joan said, which is how it happened. Someone used the file to create a referral that wasn't real. They're still investigating how it was done. "So who is—" I started. "We don't know," she said. "They called the police. They asked him very calmly, with Joan present, who he was. He was very calm in return. He said his name was Carl Hennessy. He didn't know what they were talking about. There must be a mistake. The police took him for questioning. He was cooperative and calm throughout. I wasn't there for what came after. I was put on administrative leave for a week while they investigated the intake process. It wasn't my fault, and they knew it, and I came back to work after the week. But I've never worked a night shift with quite the same ease since. What I keep coming back to is the phone call the night before Joan called me in. Who he called, or who called him. Whether whoever was on the other end warned him. Whether he knew, going in that morning, what was coming, and had decided to maintain the performance until there was no point. What I keep coming back to is Mrs. Ferreira in the hall, her voice low, saying, "He smiles at the right times, and, have you noticed it? He was good. He was genuinely good at it. Good enough that I'd spent 5 weeks having conversations with him at 3 in the morning and walked away from each one, feeling like I'd connected with someone real. And maybe I had. Maybe there is no meaningful distinction between someone real and someone performing realness with sufficient skill. I don't know, I'm not a philosopher. But something in me keeps insisting there's a difference. Keeps insisting it with an urgency it can't fully justify. The thing I haven't been able to resolve, even after years, is the conversations themselves. The things he said, the observations about light, the specific cities, the reading, the questions he asked me, those felt true. Or maybe I just need them to have been true. Maybe that's what it does to you. When someone like that finds the exact frequency of your real self and broadcasts on it long enough that you can't fully disentangle what was real from what was performed. Because the conversations felt real. They felt more real, honestly, than a lot of the real conversations I've had. And I don't know what to do with that. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we decide what's real. Not in a philosophical way. Not in the way a college student thinks about it after their second cup of coffee and a long conversation about consciousness. I mean in a practical, daily survival kind of way. The way you decide when you come home and your door is unlocked, whether you made a mistake this morning or whether something is wrong. The way you decide when you hear a sound in the next room at 3 a.m., whether it's the house settling or whether you need to get up. We have a system for it. Most of us do. We run a quick calculation, probability, experience, logic, and we land on an answer, and we move on. And most of the time, we're right. Most of the time the door was unlocked because we were distracted. Most of the time the sound is the pipes. But sometimes the calculation is wrong. And the worst part about being wrong isn't the moment you find out. It's looking back and realizing all the moments that led there. All the times you ran the calculation and trusted your answer and moved on. And understanding that something had been true the whole time that you refused to see. I grew up in a semi-detached house on a quiet street in the north of England. You know the kind. Brick terraces, small gardens, everybody's windows facing everybody else's windows. My parents had lived there since before I was born. The house on the other side of our shared wall had been owned by the same man for as long as I could remember. His name was Gerald Moore. He was in his late 60s by the time I was old enough to notice him. White hair, always wore a gray cardigan, kept a very tidy garden. He never caused trouble. He never made noise. He waved when you passed him on the street, and he was polite in the way that people of his generation tend to be polite. Formal, measured, not unfriendly, but not warm either. He lived alone. Had done for years, as far as anyone knew. I think there had been a wife at some point, long before I was born, but she wasn't there when I was growing up. Nobody ever really talked about it. On our street, people minded their business. That was just the culture. I moved away when I was 18. University, then a job in a different city, then another job. The usual story. I came home for Christmas and sometimes in the summer, and every time I came back, nothing had changed. The street looked the same. My parents' house smelled the same. That specific combination of wood polish and the particular brand of soap my mum had always used. And Gerald was always there in his garden or at his window, always in that gray cardigan, always waving. When I was 26, my parents told me they were going to downsize. They'd been rattling around in that house since I'd left, and they'd found somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. My dad's knees were bad. My mum wanted a bungalow. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly normal. I came back to help them pack. It took 3 weekends. We sorted through 20-something years of accumulated life. Furniture, books, kitchen drawers full of batteries and rubber bands, and instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. My old bedroom had become a sort of storage room by then, full of boxes my parents had never quite unpacked after the loft was redone. On the last weekend, while my parents were out dealing with estate agent paperwork, I went up to the loft to do a final check, make sure nothing had been left behind. The loft was fully boarded, with a pull-down ladder and a light on a cable. I went up there on my own and did a slow circuit of the space, moving the light around, checking the corners. In the far corner, behind where an old wardrobe had stood, there was a gap in the boarding, a section where 2 boards didn't quite meet. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been specifically looking for forgotten things, because it was in shadow and covered by a layer of the gray fiber insulation that makes loft spaces look uniformly flat. I moved the insulation. Underneath there was a small cardboard box. It was taped shut with old brown tape, the kind that goes brittle and yellows with age. I almost just brought it downstairs without opening it. I thought it was probably just old paperwork or photographs my parents had forgotten about. I opened it. Inside were photographs, probably 60 or 70 of them, printed on proper photo paper, some of them faded, some of them remarkably crisp. They were all taken from the same angle, a slight elevation, looking slightly downward through a window. The window had a net curtain, and the photographs were taken through or from beside it. You could sometimes see the edge of the fabric at the corner of the frame. The window they were taken through was in our house. I recognized the frame, the particular way the light fell. The photographs were taken from inside our loft, through the small circular vent window at the gable end. They were photographs of Gerald Moore's house, of Gerald Moore's garden, of Gerald Moore. I sat there on the loft boards for a long time looking at them. My brain was doing that calculation thing, running through explanations, trying to find the one that made sense. Maybe they were my father's. Maybe my father had some sort of dispute with Gerald at some point and had been keeping some kind of record. Maybe there was a perfectly mundane explanation, but the photographs went back years. The earliest ones, based on the quality and the way they'd faded, were probably from the late 90s. Gerald in them was younger, darker-haired, wearing a different cardigan. Some of them were taken in summer, some in winter. Some of them were close-ups, taken with a zoom lens, showing Gerald's face very clearly. They stopped around 2004 or 2005, based on the colors, the paper quality. I went downstairs and looked at the vent window from outside the house. It was barely visible, high up on the gable end, half obscured by the gutter. You would never notice it from the street. You would never think to look at it. When my parents came home, I showed them the box. My mom didn't recognize it. My dad didn't recognize it. They were both clearly unsettled by it, though my dad kept trying to sound rational, kept suggesting that maybe a previous owner of the house had some sort of issue with Gerald, some dispute about the garden or the boundary. They'd bought the house in 1981. Before I was born, they didn't know everything about its history. But here's the thing. The box was hidden, properly hidden, tucked into a gap in the boarding that you would have had to know was there to find. And it was sealed with tape that had aged along with the photographs. Whoever put it there had put it there at the same time as the most recent photographs, around 2004, and had not opened it since. We sat in the kitchen and talked about it for a long time, and eventually my dad said something that I've thought about almost every day since. He said, quietly, not dramatically, just as a plain statement. He said that in 2004, their loft was re-insulated. A company came in and did the whole job. New boarding, new insulation. My dad had been at work. My mum had supervised the job. The workmen had been in the loft for most of a day. But before the workmen arrived, someone had been there. Someone had been up in that loft through the hatch with a camera and a zoom lens for years. Someone had watched Gerald Moore from inside our house, from inside our family's home. And before the loft was redone, before strangers came in who might have found things, that person had sealed those photographs in a box and hidden them and walked away. We reported it to the police. They came and looked at the photographs. They were professionally polite, but clearly uncertain what crime, if any, had been committed. Surveillance of a neighbor, old photographs, no identifiable suspect. They took the box and said they'd look into it, and we never heard back. Gerald Moore was still alive then, still in his gray cardigan. I didn't tell him. I wasn't sure what to tell him. I've thought about this so many times since. Not just the obvious horror of it, that someone had access to my parents' house for years without them knowing, that someone had been in our loft. But the other thing, the thing about Gerald, someone had watched him. Someone had watched him closely, carefully, over years with a zoom lens, through the gap in our wall's vent. Someone had watched him from 60 or 70 separate sessions, documented it, printed the photographs, hidden them. And Gerald had never known. He had gone about his life, his garden, his cardigan, his solitary evenings. And someone had been watching him from inside the neighboring house. Not from outside where a person might have noticed, but from inside, hidden, patient. I don't know who. I've never found out. My parents moved. I don't go back to that street. But I think about Gerald sometimes, about how strange it is that you can be observed so thoroughly, so patiently, and have absolutely no idea that someone can know the rhythm of your life. When you come outside, when you draw your curtains, what you look like when you think no one is watching. and you can move through all of it completely unaware. Gerald died a few years ago. I saw it in a local paper online. He was 81. The notice said he was a private man who kept himself to himself. I have no idea if whoever took those photographs is still alive. I have no idea if they ever stopped. I have no idea if they simply chose a different window. There's a particular kind of tired that comes after a long stretch of night shifts. It's not like regular tiredness. It doesn't respond to coffee or fresh air. It lives in the back of your eyes and behind your temples, and it makes the world feel slightly out of focus, slightly removed, like you're watching your own life through a window, rather than living it. I was doing night shifts at a self-storage facility for about 18 months. This was when I was between proper jobs. I'd left a position at a logistics company and was waiting for something better to come along, and in the meantime, I needed to pay rent. The storage place was called something generic and corporate, one of those names that tells you nothing about what the company actually is. Secure something, or something storage. I don't remember exactly, and I'd rather not say specifically. The job was quiet. That was the main thing you needed to know about it. Nights at a storage facility are genuinely profoundly quiet in a way that most people never experience. You're sitting in a small office behind a glass window, and beyond the office is a long corridor of metal units, and beyond those units are more corridors, and beyond those are more corridors still, and it goes on, hundreds of units arranged in rows in a large warehouse-style building. And at night, all of those units are locked and silent and full of other people's things. I liked it for a while. I had a small television in this office, a kettle, a chair that was almost but not quite comfortable enough to fall asleep in. My job was simple. Log anyone who came in or out, monitor the security cameras, answer the phone if it rang. People that accessed their units 24 hours a day with a key card. Night visits were rare but not unusual. People with business reasons, people moving house at odd hours, people who just kept strange schedules. For the first 6 months, nothing happened that I would call remarkable. I sat in my little glass office, watched my little television, made tea, occasionally buzzed in a late-night visitor, and went home at 6 in the morning when the day manager arrived. Then things started with the car. It was a dark blue Honda. The kind of car that blends completely into any car park anywhere in the country. Nothing distinctive about it. No unusual modifications, no memorable plate, beyond the fact that it began with the same 2 letters as my own car at the time, which is the only reason I started noticing it. It would park in the far corner of the facility's car park, which was visible on my cameras, but barely. It was the edge of the camera's range. The image was grainy, and the car just sat there, dark, engine apparently off, no interior light on. The first time I noticed it, I noted it in my log as a matter of routine, unknown vehicle in car park, and then forgot about it. The second time, a week later, I noted it again, frowned at the screen for a moment, and then went back to the television. The third time, I realized something. I don't know if I noticed consciously or whether it crept up on me over several more sightings. But at some point it clicked that the car was always there on specific nights. Not every night, not randomly. It was there on certain nights, and those nights corresponded to something. I went back through my logs. I'd been meticulous about logging entries. It was drilled into us during training. Everything goes in the log, time-stamped. I cross-referenced the nights the Honda appeared with the nights that had notable events. The car appeared on every night that Unit 714 was accessed. Unit 714 was rented to a woman whose name appears in my records as M. Calloway. She had been renting the unit for about 4 years by the time I started working there. She was one of the more frequent night visitors. She came in maybe once or twice a month, usually between 11 and 1, used her key card, spent 20 to 40 minutes in the unit, and left. I had no reason to think anything about this. Lots of people used the facility at odd hours. It wasn't my business what was in the units or why people accessed them when they did. But I started paying attention the next time M. Calloway came in. It was a Wednesday, I think. Early winter. The car park was empty and frost was forming on the painted lines. The Honda was there in its corner. I watched on the cameras. Calloway's car came in. She went through the entrance. The internal cameras picked her up, walking down corridor 7. She unlocked 714 with her key. She went inside. She was in there for about 30 minutes. The Honda didn't move the entire time. No one got in or out. It just sat there. When Calloway left, the Honda was still there. It didn't leave until about 20 minutes after her, and then it backed out quietly and turned left out of the car park. I noted the full plate number this time. I'd been meaning to before, but somehow kept getting distracted. Over the next few months, I tracked it carefully. The pattern held absolutely without exception. The Honda appeared every time Calloway visited. It appeared no other time. It arrived before her, sometimes by as much as an hour, and left after her. It never came close to the entrance. It never tried to come inside. It simply waited. I didn't sleep well during this period, not because the situation was overtly threatening. It wasn't, not in any way I could articulate, but because I couldn't figure it out. My brain would turn it over at odd hours. Who parks in a storage facility car park for an hour in the middle of the night? Why only when that specific unit is accessed? Was it someone watching Calloway? Someone she knew? Someone tracking her? A private investigator? An ex-partner? I told the day manager. She shrugged in the way that people shrug when they don't want the complication. She said to keep logging it, and if anything actually happened, to call the police. She said people parked in our car park all the time, and we couldn't do anything about it. She wasn't wrong, technically, but it settled into me, that discomfort. I looked up the plate number online. I found a site that tracks plates flagged in various ways. Reports, previous incidents, that kind of thing. And the number came up clean. Nothing. No flags, no history. I tried to find more about Unit 7-14. Facility policy meant I only had access to the rental name and payment history. Calloway had been paying monthly, always on time, always by direct debit. Contact number on file. I wasn't supposed to use it except in emergencies, and the situation didn't qualify as an emergency. Then one night, at about 2 in the morning, Calloway walked back past the office after her visit to Unit 714, and she stopped. She looked in through the glass at me. Most visitors don't. The glass is tinted from outside. You can see through it from inside, but from outside it's semi-reflective. Most people don't realize there's someone sitting there. They walk past. But she stopped, and she looked directly at me. or directly at where I was sitting, which she shouldn't have been able to see. And she held that for a moment. Then she left. I checked the car park camera. The Honda was there. It was always there. 2 weeks later, she came again. Same time, approximately. Same unit, same duration. But this time, when she came back past the office, she stopped again, and this time she knocked on the glass. Gently. Twice. I opened the door. She was younger than I'd imagined. Mid-30s, dark coat, hair that looked like she'd had it up earlier in the evening and it had slowly come loose. She looked tired. Not the storage unit at 2 a.m. kind of tired. The kind that's been going on for much longer. She said quietly, "You've been watching." I didn't know what to say to that. I said something about it being my job to monitor the facility, which was technically true. She nodded like she expected that answer. Then she said, "The blue car. You've seen it?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the car park, though from where we were standing she couldn't see the far corner. She said, and she said it very flatly, very simply, "I don't know who it is." That was all. She didn't ask for help. She didn't ask me to call the police. She just said she didn't know who it was. I asked how long the car had been there. She said she'd first noticed it about 7 months earlier. She said she'd tried calling the police, but the car always left before they could come. And it had never followed her anywhere else. It only ever appeared there. She said she'd tried coming at different times. The car was always there. She'd tried coming without telling anyone where she was going, having given no indication of her plans, and the car was still always there. She stopped coming to the facility after that. I don't know if she moved her things out first or just abandoned the unit. The direct debit continued for several more months before lapsing. The Honda appeared one more time after that, about 3 weeks after Calloway's last visit. It sat in the corner of the car park for two hours. Then it left. It never came back. I've thought about it many times since, about all the possible explanations. GPS tracker on Calloway's car, someone with access to her calendar, someone close to her who knew her habits, all logical, all explainable, and I know that's probably what it was. Someone tracking her, some kind of stalking situation that she was trying to handle quietly, coming to her storage unit in the middle of the night to deal with whatever was in there away from wherever they could watch her. But what I come back to is this. She said she'd tried coming at different times, with no announcement, no pattern, and the car was still always there, which means whoever it was didn't need to know when she was coming. They just needed to know as soon as she arrived, which means the information was reaching them in real time, which means, if not a tracker on her car, which she would presumably have checked for, something else. Someone at the facility, maybe, or something on her phone. I don't work there anymore, but I've changed my habits since. I notice parked cars now in a way I didn't before. I notice whether they're occupied or dark inside. I notice whether the same car appears in the same place more than once. I'm sure it's nothing, usually. Almost certainly nothing. I just don't always run the calculation the same way I used to. My mother kept a very specific kind of order in our house. Everything had a place and everything returned to it. The cushions on the sofa were arranged in a specific way, 2 upright at either end, 1 diagonal in the middle. And if you moved them to sit comfortably, She'd rearrange them as soon as you stood up. The mugs were stacked in a particular sequence. The towels were folded in thirds, never in halves. I grew up thinking this was just how organized people lived. Some people care about the arrangement of things. Some people don't. My mother was one who cared. Fine. Normal. I moved to a flat on my own when I was 22. Started my first proper job. Started my adult life. The flat was small. A living room, a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. A bedroom, a bathroom with a shower that sometimes worked and sometimes just stood there. It was mine, though. First time I'd ever had a space entirely my own. I settled in. I did what everyone does when they first live alone. I made the space fit me rather than fitting myself to the space. Books in the order I liked. Kitchen things arranged by how often I used them. The sofa set at the angle that let me see both the television and the window. I had a routine. Work was predictable. I was doing data entry for an insurance company, and while it was deeply unchallenging, the predictability was something I was grateful for at the time. I left the flat every morning at 8, came home at 6, cooked something simple, read or watched something, and went to bed. On weekends, I'd see friends, sometimes go home to see my parents. Simple, quiet, fine. The first thing I noticed, I can tell you the exact date, because I wrote it down. It was a Tuesday in the second month after I'd moved in. I came home from work, and the mug I'd left on the draining board. I always left it upside down on the draining board after washing it. Was right side up. That's it. That's the whole thing. The mug was the right way up instead of upside down. I stood there and looked at it for a moment. Then I thought, I must have put it right side up today without thinking. I'm tired. I do things automatically when I'm tired. I turned it upside down out of habit and went about my evening. The next week, it was a kitchen chair. I have 2 chairs at my small kitchen table. I always push them back into the table when I stand up. This was one of my mother's habits that I'd absorbed without meaning to. I came home on a Thursday, and one of the chairs was pulled slightly out from the table. Not dramatically, just a few inches, as if someone had sat in it and then stood up and not pushed it back. I ran through explanations. Maybe I'd been rushing that morning. Maybe I'd had a phone call while I was making breakfast and had moved the chair and not put it back. Perfectly possible. I pushed it in and moved on. Over the next 3 weeks, there were 7 incidents. I logged them all, because somewhere in the back of my mind, something was quietly keeping count, even before I consciously decided to keep count. The chair moved. A book on my bedside table turned so the spine faced the wall rather than outward. The shower curtain pulled fully closed when I always left it slightly open to let the air in. 2 tins in the kitchen cupboard switched in position. My keys, which I always hung on the hook by the door, placed instead on the kitchen counter. None of these were large. None of them were alarming on their own. And every time, I had an explanation ready. I was distracted. I was tired. I was rushing. I did it automatically. But 7 times, over 3 weeks. And I was beginning to feel a low, persistent unease that I couldn't quite justify to myself, because every individual explanation was reasonable, and yet the accumulation of them felt wrong. I called my mom. I told her what I'd been noticing, and asked, as casually as I could, whether she thought I might be sleepwalking or doing things in a distracted state that I wasn't consciously registering. She laughed a little. and said she didn't think so, but that living alone could make you hyper-aware of small things because there was no one else to blame them on. That made sense. I held on to that. I told myself I was being hyper-aware. Then I came home one evening and found the window in my bedroom open. Not wide open, 3 inches, maybe 4, but I hadn't opened it. I was certain. It was October, and I hadn't opened that window since August. I remember specifically deciding in late September that it was cold enough at night to keep it closed. There was a very precise memory in my mind of reaching up and closing the window and twisting the handle and thinking, that's it for the summer. The handle was twisted open. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and looked at the open window and felt, for the first time, something different from the low background unease I'd been carrying. Something sharper, something more specific. I checked the flat. I don't know what I expected to find, but I opened every cupboard and looked behind every door and stood in the bathroom with the shower curtain pushed back. Nothing. The flat was empty. I closed and locked the window. I sat down on the sofa and tried to think clearly. There were 3 explanations, as I saw them. 1, I was doing these things myself in a state of tiredness or distraction, and simply not registering them. 2, someone had access to my flat, a duplicate key, a copied key, something, and was coming in. 3, something was wrong with my memory in a way I hadn't identified. None of these explanations felt good. I called my landlord and said I'd been having some security concerns and asked whether anyone else had a key to the flat. He said he had a spare key, as was standard. I asked if anyone had used it recently, and he said absolutely not, that he'd never enter a tenant's property without a minimum of 24 hours notice in a non-emergency, which was the legal requirement. He sounded slightly put out by the question. I bought a chain for the inside of my front door. The incidents slowed down after that, or I stopped noticing them, which is possible. Maybe I was watching so carefully that I was keeping everything exactly in place, or maybe I was allowing a wider margin before I classified something as wrong. Either way, for about 3 weeks, things were still. And then I found the photographs. I was cleaning behind the sofa, a thing I did infrequently and with great reluctance. And in the gap between the sofa back and the baseboard of the wall, I found 4 photographs, printed, not on photo paper, but on ordinary printer paper. Slightly creased, they were photographs of my flat, while I was in it. They'd been taken through the window. The angle and the slight distortion of the glass was visible in 3 of the 4. From outside, from the pavement, at night. The living room window, the one that faced the street, showed from outside. Someone had photographed the interior. In one of them you could see me clearly, sitting on the sofa, reading. In another I was in the kitchen, which was visible at an angle through the open connecting door. In one of them, I was asleep. The light was off in the living room, but there was enough ambient street light that you could make out the sofa, the shape of someone on it, a blanket. I'd fallen asleep on the sofa. I remember those evenings. I often fell asleep reading and woke up at 2 or 3 in the morning, stiff-necked and disoriented. The photographs had been pushed through the gap behind the sofa. Not dropped, not blown there, pushed. The gap was too narrow and too low to the ground for them to have gotten there accidentally. Someone had been in my flat and had placed those photographs deliberately in a place where I would eventually find them. I stared at them for a long time. And then I thought about the moved mug, the open window, all the small things that had shifted slightly, again and again. I understood then that whoever had been doing this, whatever the full shape of it was, some of it was happening from outside, through the window, and some of it was happening inside. And the inside incidents were, I think, a message. Not a threatening message, not an escalating one, just a demonstration. Look what I can do. Look how close I can get. I moved out of the flat the following month. I didn't tell many people why. What would I have said? I found photographs of myself that someone had hidden behind my sofa, and also they've been moving my kitchen chair. The police came, took a statement, were not visibly alarmed. They referred me to a victim support line. They took the photographs. Nothing ever came of it. I've never found out who it was. I live somewhere different now. A flat on the 3rd floor, no accessible windows, a video doorbell, double locked, and I'm fine. I am genuinely, honestly fine. But I check behind the sofa. I check every time I clean. I've always found nothing every time since. I just can't quite make myself stop checking. Let me tell you about a job I had when I was 19. It doesn't sound interesting. When I describe it to people, they tend to nod politely and then change the subject, because what is there to say about a waitress job in a small hotel in the Lake District? I worked there for 7 months over the summer and into the autumn. I needed money. I needed to get away from home for a while. Things were difficult at home at the time, and someone I vaguely knew said there was work at this hotel if I wanted it. The hotel was old, not grand old, not boutique old, just old. The kind of building that has been added to and modified so many times over so many decades that its original shape is completely obscured. It had a main building, a newer wing from the 70s that looked awkward next to the original stonework, and a handful of cottages in the grounds that were let separately to long-stay guests or walkers. The owner was a man in his 60s. I'll call him Douglas. His wife helped run the place. Front desk, admin. There were 3 other members of staff. Another waitress closer to my age named Priya. A cook called Bernard who spoke very little, and a groundskeeper whose name I genuinely can't remember now. An older man who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Douglas was pleasant enough, brisk, efficient, not interested in conversation but not unkind. His wife was warmer, always offering tea, always remembering details about guests that Douglas had already forgotten. The hotel had a guest who had been staying there for almost a year. I'll call him Mr. Ellison. His real name I knew, because I saw it on the register and heard it used. He was a real person in the real world who I've changed the name of, as I've changed all names in all of these stories, because names feel too personal, and besides, they're not the point. Mr. Ellison was in his late 40s or early 50s. He was quiet in the way that long-stay guests in small hotels tend to become quiet, integrated into the routine of the place. Part of the furniture almost, not demanding the attention that short-stay guests need. He ate breakfast at the same time every morning, 8 o'clock, always a full-cooked breakfast, always the same table, by the window. He spent most of each day out of the hotel, walking, he said, when anyone asked. He was a writer, apparently, working on something, using the quiet of the Lake District to concentrate. He came back mid-afternoon, worked in his room or sometimes in the small bar that doubled as a sitting room, and had dinner at 7. He was polite to staff. Not warm, exactly, but consistently courteous. Please and thank you. Always remembered your name. Never complained. After a few weeks of serving him breakfast and dinner every day, Priya and I barely noticed him. He was like a piece of furniture, in the kindest possible way. About 3 months in, I started noticing something. It started with the walk. Douglas sometimes asked me, if I had no other immediate duties, to take the afternoon tea tray up to Mr. Ellison's room. He was in room 14, one of the rooms in the original building, on the first floor, overlooking the garden and the path that led down to the lake. I didn't do this every day, but 2 or 3 times a week. The 3rd or 4th time I went up with the tray, the door to room 14 was not fully closed. I knocked, quietly, because the tray was heavy and it's hard to knock properly while holding a full tea tray, and waited. No response. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to set the tray down outside the door, which was what you were supposed to do if the guest didn't answer, when through the gap, I saw something that I've had difficulty describing accurately since. Mr. Ellison was sitting in the chair by the window. He was fully dressed. He was facing the window, looking out at the garden and the path, and he wasn't moving, not just still, not reading still or thinking still, completely motionless, the kind of stillness that doesn't come naturally to people, that you have to practice or that comes from an unusual depth of concentration. His hands were on his knees, his back was straight, and he was looking out at the path. I don't know how long I stood there, 30 seconds maybe, long enough to know that this wasn't someone who'd just paused or zoned out. The quality of the stillness was different, and there was something about the angle of his head, not looking at the garden generally, but at something specific, at the path. I left the tray outside the door. I went back downstairs and tried to put it out of my mind. He was meditating. He was doing a breathing exercise. He was having a strange afternoon. Lots of explanations. But I started noticing the path. The path that ran from the hotel garden down to the lake was used by everyone. Guests, walkers from outside who had a right-of-way, the groundskeeper. It was a narrow path through slightly overgrown grass, winding between 2 lines of old oak trees before it opened up at the lakeside. I started noticing that Mr. Ellison always seemed to know when people were on the path. He'd be in the bar or at the breakfast table, and he'd glance toward the window at exactly the moment someone appeared on the path outside. Not after they'd appeared, at the moment, as if he'd registered some cue the rest of us hadn't. I mentioned it to Priya. She gave me a look that said she thought I was making too much of something small, and maybe she was right. He knows the view from every window in this hotel better than we do, she pointed out. He's been here almost a year. Maybe he just hears footsteps on the path. That was fair. That was reasonable. I made myself accept it. One afternoon in September, the days were getting shorter. The tourists were thinning out. The hotel was quiet. I was walking back from the village on the road that ran parallel to the hotel grounds. You could see the hotel from that road, and specifically you could see the windows of the upper floor. As I walked, I glanced up at the hotel. Mr. Ellison was in his window, standing, not sitting, looking out. He was looking in the direction of the path, but from his window at that angle, he couldn't see the path. The oak trees obstructed the view. He was looking at something beyond the trees, at the far end of the path near the lake. I turned and looked in that direction. At the lakeside, barely visible at this distance, I could see a figure, a person standing at the water's edge. I looked back at the hotel window. Mr. Ellison was still there. I walked on. It's nothing, I told myself. He has a view of the lake from his window. He looks at the lake. There happens to be someone there. Normal. But I thought about it that evening. And the thing I thought about was this. The figure at the lakeside. I'd only caught a glimpse, but the figure had been standing very still, looking in the direction of the hotel. I put it together in a way that I couldn't quite let go of. The person at the lake looking at the hotel. Mr. Ellison at the hotel window looking at the lake. Both of them still. Both of them watching. 2 weeks later, I found out that Mr. Ellison was not writing a book. I found out because Priya found out first and told me. Priya had been doing some amateur investigation of her own, based on things she'd noticed that she hadn't mentioned to me, and what she'd found was this. There was no book. His name, his real name, didn't appear in any publishing database, no agent listings, nothing. He had no professional record of any kind as a writer. More than that, she'd found a news article from about 4 years prior. Local newspaper from a different part of the country. The name, a description that matched him closely, and a brief piece about a restraining order that had been issued. The subject of the restraining order, the person he was ordered to stay away from, was not named in the article. The circumstances weren't fully described. We told Douglas. Douglas thanked us for telling him and went very quiet. Mr. Ellison checked out the following week. Douglas told him, as diplomatically as possible, that he couldn't extend his stay any further. Mr. Ellison left without incident, polite, as always, said the hotel had been wonderful. Here's what I've never been able to resolve. The person at the lake, the figure who'd been standing at the water's edge, looking at the hotel. Was that the person Mr. Ellison was there watching? Had they found each other? The watcher and the watched? And was that two-way stillness at a distance some kind of terrible communication, both of them exactly where they'd been told not to be? Or was the figure at the lake someone else entirely? Something else to think about and not be able to resolve? I left the hotel job in October, when the season properly ended. I've driven past the building once since, years later, on my way somewhere else. It looked the same. The path through the oak trees was still there. The lake was still there. I didn't stop. I want to tell you about the summer I spent in my grandmother's house. She had died the previous winter, and the house had been left to my mother and my aunt jointly, and for months they hadn't been able to agree on what to do with it. Sell, rent, divide, clear. It sat empty through the spring. Then my mum asked if I'd be willing to go and stay there for the summer and sort through my grandmother's things, because neither she nor my aunt could face it. And I was between commitments at the time, and it felt like something I could give them. I want to be clear that I wasn't frightened of the house. I'd spent a lot of my childhood there. I knew every room, every creak, every oddness of the building. It was in a small town in the Scottish borders, not isolated, not remote, just small and quiet. A stone terraced house, 2 stories, a garden that had become somewhat overgrown in the years when my grandmother's mobility was limited. It smelled the way houses smell when an older person has lived in them for decades. Dry warmth, particular soap, a faint background note of something you can't name. I arrived in June. I'd packed enough for 3 months and settled myself into the upstairs bedroom I'd always used as a child. Smaller than the master, looking out over the back garden and the yards of the neighboring houses. I slept fine the first few nights. I woke each morning to birds and the distant sound of the main road. I started going through cupboards and boxes. My grandmother was not a sentimental woman. I'd always known this, but sorting through her things confirmed it. She kept very little. Practical items, functional items, a few photographs, neatly arranged, nothing loose. Her documentation, utility bills, letters, medical correspondence, was filed with a precision that I found impressive and slightly funny. She had been a careful woman. Nothing in her house surprised me, except for the drawer. In the living room there was an old sideboard, dark wood, heavy. It held glassware on the top half and on the bottom half. 2 wide drawers. I'd helped my grandmother with those drawers many times as a child, helping her find this or that. The bottom drawer I remembered being full of assorted practical items, batteries, candles, rubber bands, the miscellany that accumulates in household drawers. But the top drawer, I realized, I had never opened. I had a clear memory of watching my grandmother open it once, reaching in and taking something out and closing it again quickly, and I had a child's sense of that as a private space. Not for me. I hadn't thought about it in years. I opened it. It was packed with letters, bundled neatly with rubber bands, arranged in what I could see, when I started looking more carefully, was chronological order. The earliest ones were from the 1960s. They were all to my grandmother, her name on the envelopes, and they were all from the same sender. The return address where one was given was a street in Glasgow. The name on the return address was a man's name, a name I didn't recognize, a name that appeared nowhere else in anything I'd found in the house. I read a few of them, carefully, with the feeling of someone doing something slightly wrong. They were, and this is the word that kept coming to me as I read, tender. They were tender letters, careful and warm, full of references to things I had no context for. A particular place they had apparently visited together, a conversation on a specific date, a shared understanding of something I couldn't work out. They were the letters of 2 people who knew each other very well and cared for each other very much. My grandmother had been married to my grandfather. He had died when I was small. I barely remembered him. My mother and aunt had been close to him, had spoken of him warmly in the way you speak of people who are gone. He had been, as far as any family narrative went, the great love of my grandmother's life. These letters were not from my grandfather. They predated her marriage, some of them, and some were concurrent with it. The latest one was dated 1987, which was, I worked it out, when I was 3 years old. I sat on the living room floor for a long time with the letters. I want to be clear that what I felt wasn't shock in the way you might expect. I hadn't found evidence of something wrong exactly. My grandmother had been human and complex and had lived a long life, and it wasn't for me to judge any of it. What I felt was more like disorientation, a fundamental shift in the geography of something I thought I knew. And then, this is the part that I come back to, something else. I started reading more carefully. The letters, between the tenderness and the references I couldn't decode, were also worried. Some of them were worried, in a consistent, specific way. The man writing was worried about my grandmother's safety, not in an abstract way, not in the way you worry about someone's health or well-being in general, in a very particular way, with very particular references, to a specific person whose name was always abbreviated to an initial in the letters, never spelled out. He was worried about what this person, this B, or this R, I can't remember the initial clearly now, was capable of. In one letter, from 1974, he wrote something that I've thought about many times since. He wrote, "You must stop pretending everything is fine. You are much better at it than they are at believing it, and eventually they will stop needing to believe it." I read that sentence 4 or 5 times. I understood the grammar of it, the structure, but the meaning, what it was pointing at, was just out of reach. I phoned my mum that evening. I told her I'd found letters in the sideboard and asked about the name on them. There was a pause, a particular kind of pause, the kind that contains a decision. She said she didn't know anyone by that name. I believed her. I still believe she genuinely didn't know, but there was something in the pause before the answer that told me she wasn't entirely surprised by the question, that somewhere in the background of her childhood knowledge was something she had registered without fully understanding. I spent the rest of the summer in that house. I sorted everything. I did what I'd come to do. I packed the letters with everything else that belonged to my grandmother's life, and sent them to my mother with a note saying that she should probably read them when she was ready. I don't know if she's read them. We haven't talked about it. There are some conversations that families circle around for years before anyone opens them. But here's what stays with me. My grandmother was the most composed person I knew. She had a stillness to her that I had always read as contentment, as the particular peace of old age, and a life well lived. She was not a demonstrative woman, but she seemed fundamentally all right. And I wonder now, lying awake in the house that was her house, listening to the buildings settle around me, going back over the 30-something years I knew her, I wonder what was under that composure. I wonder about that letter. "You are much better at pretending than they are at believing." I wonder what she spent her life pretending, and who the person was with the initial, and what it was they were capable of. I sorted through her whole house. I opened every cupboard, went through every drawer. I found nothing that answered any of it. She had been meticulous. She had kept what she chose to keep and disposed of everything else. She had kept the letters. I don't know if that was an accident or a choice. I've never been able to decide which one I find more unsettling. I'm going to tell you about a road, not a dramatic road, not a mountain pass or a cliff-edge coastal route, just a road, a B road in the north of England, the kind that connects small towns to smaller towns, that runs through farmland and occasional patches of woodland, that most people only use if they live nearby or if they've turned off the motorway to avoid traffic. I drove this road regularly for about 2 years. I was working as a community support worker at the time, visiting clients in their homes, and my route took me out of the town where I lived, along this road, past a village, and then several miles further on to a cluster of houses and small farms where several of my clients lived. I drove it 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the morning and again in late afternoon. I knew it well. I knew its bends, its potholes, its patches of ice in winter. I knew where the road narrowed and where there was room to pass oncoming vehicles. There is a point on this road, about 4 miles out of town, where it crosses a small stone bridge over a stream and then goes into a short stretch of woodland, maybe half a mile of tree cover, then back out into farmland. The woodland section was always slightly darker, the road surface slightly more uneven. It was the kind of stretch you drove through a little faster than you should, not because anything was specifically wrong, but because the trees were close, and you were always glad to be out of it. In the second year of driving that road, I started noticing a man. He was always on foot, always walking in the same direction, away from town, toward the village, always on the right-hand verge, facing oncoming traffic, which was correct, which was what you were supposed to do. He was medium height, wearing a dark jacket. It could have been different dark jackets. I was passing at 30 or 40 miles an hour. I couldn't say with certainty it was always the same one. He had his head down, slightly, in the way people walk when they're concentrating on the ground rather than their surroundings. I drove past him the first time and didn't think anything of it. People walk along rural roads. It's not unusual. The second time was 3 days later, roughly the same location, same direction, same posture. I thought, same guy. Maybe he lives somewhere along here and walks this route regularly. By the 5th or 6th time, spread over a month or so, I was paying attention. He was always in the woodland section or just before it. Not exactly the same spot, but within a range of about 200 meters in that area. Morning times mostly, though I sometimes saw him on an afternoon return. And he was always walking the same direction, away from town. I never saw him coming back. I never saw him in the village when I arrived, or anywhere further along the road. He was always in that stretch, always going away from town, and as far as I ever saw, never arrived anywhere. I know the logical explanation. I drove that route at inconsistent times. I might have simply never timed my drive to coincide with his return. He might live in the woodland section itself. There were a couple of properties set back from the road, not visible from the road itself. He might take a different route back. 100 reasons why I never saw him walking the other way. But the mind fixes on things. I started timing my drives differently, trying to come back along the road at various times of day. I started watching the verge more carefully. I tried to get a better look at his face as I passed, but the combination of speed and his downward tilted head meant I never quite did. Then in winter, December, dark mornings, I passed him at 8 in the morning in the woodland section, and I'd been thinking about this for months by then, and I made a decision. I pulled over about 100 meters past him and waited for him to come level with my car. He didn't. I sat there for 5 minutes and he didn't appear. I got out of the car. I walked back along the verge to where I'd seen him, which was less than 100 meters. There was no one there. The road was straight, and I could see it clearly for several hundred meters in both directions. No one. There was a gap in the trees on the right-hand side. Not a path, just a gap, the kind that forms naturally where 2 trees don't quite fill the space. Wide enough for a person to slip through into the woodland. The ground beyond the gap was soft with winter mud. I could see what might have been a footprint, though the ground was churned and wet, and I couldn't be sure. I went back to my car and drove on. I told a colleague about it, a woman who'd been working in that area for several years before I joined the service. She listened to my description and then said, not unkindly, that I was probably just seeing the same local who walked that stretch every day. She said some people have very regular walking routes, and that if you see someone on the same road repeatedly, you start constructing a story around them. I knew she was right. I knew that was probably all it was. A man, a walking route, my own imagination filling in the gaps. But here's the thing I never told her, the thing I went back and checked, weeks later, when I'd convinced myself. It was nothing. There were 3 properties set back from that section of road. I'd looked up the addresses, partly out of professional habit, knowing the area was part of the job, and partly because I'd been telling myself that if I could verify that someone lived there, I'd let it go. The 3 properties were a farmhouse, unoccupied since the previous year when the elderly farmer who'd lived there alone had gone into residential care, a barn conversion that was owned as a holiday let and had no permanent residence, and a house at the end of a long private track that was, according to local records, used for storage. No one lived on that section of road. I keep driving it in my mind. Even now, years later, living somewhere different, doing a different job. I keep driving that stretch in my memory, coming into the woodland, the road narrowing, the trees close on both sides, and on the right-hand verge, about 200 meters before the bridge, a figure, head down, walking away from town. I try to tell myself it was just a man walking, a man I never got a good look at, a man whose comings and goings I simply wasn't there to witness. I mostly believe that. I don't entirely believe that. These last few minutes, I want to sit with you a little. You're probably still awake. Maybe you're close to the edge of sleep, that place where things are soft and logic is starting to slip. Maybe you've been here with me for a while now, and you're tired in the good way. I want to say something quiet before I let you go. I've thought a lot about why these things stay with us. The blue Honda in the car park, the photographs behind the sofa, the man on the road, the grandmother's letters. None of them are screaming things. None of them announce themselves. They're the kind of thing that sits at the edge of your vision, and then, when you turn to look directly at it, it's gone. Or it's still there, perfectly innocent, perfectly explainable, and yet the feeling doesn't dissolve. It just retreats a little. I think what frightens us about these stories isn't the unknown thing. It's the known thing, seen wrong. It's the house you grew up in, where someone was in the loft. It's the road you drove twice a week, where someone was waiting. It's the grandmother you loved and thought you understood. The house is still the house. The road is still the road. But now you know something, and you can't unknow it. That's what these stories do to you. Not the screaming kind, not the sudden kind, the quiet kind, the kind that takes your familiar world and says, look at this. Look at this angle you never looked at before. The light's still on in the hallway. The house around you is still the same house it's always been. The sounds it makes in the night are the same sounds it's always made. You know that. You've always known that. But now, before you close your eyes, You might just lie there for a moment and think about the thing you've been calculating as normal, as routine, as explained. That small thing you keep noticing and keep deciding is nothing. And you might wonder, quietly, whether you've been running that calculation right. Sleep well.